Our next speaker is Janice Harvey, the Green Party of Canada's Fisheries Critic, and she'll be speaking about the changes to the Fisheries Act and the impacts. Welcome, Janice.
I can't do two things at once. That's okay. Hi. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for coming on this nice evening. I actually, as I was sitting there listening to Dave Wildish, I was thinking there's a whole other rap I could do here. I'm going to give you a taste of it, and I apologize for taking a little bit of extra time to do that. But the reason I'm the fisheries critic for the Green Party of Canada is because I spent 17 years with the Conservation Council developing and working on our marine conservation program. And what occurred to me as Dave Wildish was listing the research that he has been involved in and the station's been involved in is much of that, those issues, much of the information, many of the issues that he talked about, the Conservation Council was also involved in. And what is missing, I think, or what we sometimes forget, is how important DFO's research is to public advocacy and environmental organizations. We published several reports out of our marine conservation program for the general public, which referenced very heavily the research that has been done here. We've worked very collaboratively with both DFO scientists and the Huntsman Marine Science Center. And you might want to know that when David Kuhn started working at the Conservation Council in 1985, one of the first phone calls he made was to Vlado Zitko, who was working here at the time in the toxicology lab. And David actually rolled his car on the way down to have this meeting with Vlado. So that's the relationship to public advocacy, I think, is very, very important, and that we need to understand that. If there's no science being done, the public has really no way of knowing what's going on in the environment, and environmental groups have very little to work with. So I just wanted to say that. And with respect to the library, one of the reports we did was the 200 years of ecosystem change in the Quadi region, researched and written by Heike Lotz at Dalhousie and Inka Malevsky, who was at the Huntsman and now at the Conservation Council. And the research that made that 200 years report possible was based here at the library. So that wasn't what I was going to talk about. I want to talk about a couple of things. So I'm going to speak as quickly and pack as much information into my little time left as I possibly can. So the Fisheries Act has been gutted. We know that. It was the single most important piece of environmental legislation in Canada. Its habitat provisions have been gutted, along with the federal environmental impact assessment legislation. And what we know is coming now are cuts in enforcement budgets, and the Species at Risk Act is rumored to be next. Now, the Fisheries Minister, Keith Ashfield, defends this by stating that the government wants to concentrate its resources on protecting commercially important fish and getting DFO off the backs of those who are doing nothing to harm commercially important fish. This rolls the clock back on fisheries management by 30 years. That approach to fisheries management, the single species management, was central to the groundfish collapse, and since 1992, we have been talking about ecosystem management, and for good reason. And I'm going to tell you a little story. This isn't about research that's been done here, but it's next door, that illustrates the systemic nature of the commercial fisheries. So this is, there's a recent paper that's been published by scientists at the Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences and the U.S. Geological Survey, based on 12 years of data collection relating to primary productivity in the Gulf of Maine. It was just released about a month ago. So basically what they've documented is a 5-fold decline in the growth rate of phytoplankton in the Gulf of Maine. And of course, that's the base of the food web. So what's going on? What are they seeing? They have figured out that changing rainfall patterns due to climate change has increased freshwater discharges from rivers into the Gulf of Maine. And this has increased the fine detritus and organic matter that's being deposited in coastal waters, reducing the light available for phytoplankton growth. But they also believe that this freshwater discharge, this increased freshwater discharge, is slowing the movement of cold North Atlantic water, which carries silicate and other nutrients to feed phytoplankton growth, into the Gulf through the Northeast Channel between Browns Bank and Georges Bank. So what they're seeing as well is significant decreased salinity and moderate warming of surface water. We also know that the Bay of Fundy and presumably the Gulf of Maine is acidifying. All of this will have impacts on commercial fish species. One of the scientists, the lead scientist, Barney Balch, said, this is a quote, "You can't drop the primary productivity of an ecosystem by a factor of 5 and not have an impact on other parts of the marine food web that depend on it, such as fish and lobsters." So in order to protect commercial species, you have to focus on the system in which they are located, of which they're an integral part. And this story about what's going on in the Gulf of Maine includes climate science, meteorology, oceanography, freshwater ecosystems, marine ecosystem science, all developed over decades, time series monitoring, to come together to explain this complex web of still evolving knowledge about the Gulf of Maine and Bay of Fundy system and how it interacts with atmosphere, land, rivers, and oceans. So this isn't stuff you learn in 3 years, and it isn't stuff you learn without that multidisciplinary approach that David talked about. So what is the Harper government doing? And I need to point this out, that this is all being quarterbacked by New Brunswick's own Keith Ashfield as fisheries minister. They are destroying our capacity to understand the systems which produce and support commercial species. Now, Elizabeth May has thoroughly documented this assault on science in an article called Killing Environmental Science, which is published in the Island Times on the West Coast, and it's available on her website. But this documentation, I'm going to list this because I think it's important for you to understand the whole context. Some of this is happening in St.Andrews, but it's happening across the country, and we can understand the pattern. So Stephen Harper has eliminated the position of science advisor to the Prime Minister, ended funding to the Canadian Foundation for Climate and Atmospheric Sciences, disbanded the entire Adaptation to Climate Change Research Group in Environment Canada, and disbanded the group in Natural Resources Canada researching the 80,000-year climate record in Arctic ice cores. Coming up, the cuts that have been announced are the closing of the Polar Environmental Atmospheric Research Laboratory, the Pearl facility on Ellesmere Island. It's the closest lab in the world to the North Pole. It just received $10 million in investment in state-of-the-art equipment, and it costs $1.5 million to run. They're closing the experimental lakes area near Kenora that Karen mentioned. They just spent $3 million to upgrade the labs there. The annual operating cost is $600,000, and it's to be sold to private interests. They're closing the Yukon Research Lab, which was funded by NSERC, a $2.7 million facility only opened last fall. And NSERC funding is to be redirected to research that is, quote, business-led and industry-relevant. They are ending, as we know, the DFO's National Contaminants Program, 75 marine toxicology scientists laid off. This is a quote from Dr. Peter Ross, who was just fired from the Institute for Ocean Sciences in Elizabeth May's writing. Quote, the entire pollution file for the Government of Canada and marine environment in Canada's 3 oceans will be overseen by 5 junior biologists scattered across Canada, unquote. And this is a quote from Elizabeth. At the same time as we cut climate science, we are driving up greenhouse gas emissions. As we shut down research in the effects of toxic chemicals in the Arctic marine mammals, the federal government has opened up a huge area of the Beaufort Sea for leases for oil drilling. What is clear, Elizabeth writes, is that the cuts are not about fighting the deficit. Setting out to render ourselves deaf, dumb, and blind to the impact of the Harper economic strategy we'll visit on the natural world and our own future is so short-sighted that language is inadequate. Words fail, unquote. Stephen Harper is determined to eliminate public funding to those research programs that are likely to raise public concern about the environmental impacts of the government's massive resource exploitation agenda. The $8 million in new money allocated to Revenue Canada to investigate environmental charities would fund the ongoing operation of all of the research facilities, as well as the libraries that support marine research. Elizabeth, in this article, implores people to spread the awareness of the Harper anti-science agenda and demand the cuts be reversed. This group is already doing it in St.Andrews, and I applaud you. And the unprecedented demonstration of scientists on Parliament Hill last week is another example. But it's not going to be easy, and it will take the networking of this group with all the other groups across the country that are concerned about this, and trying to generate widespread public outrage. In New Brunswick, I would suggest the target must be Conservative members of Parliament, especially John Williamson, who represents the research community in Charlotte County. And Keith Ashfield, the Fredericton MP, who is spearheading the devastation of the Fisheries Act, its enforcement capacity, and the science that supports it. The heat needs to be turned up on them. They need to be called account for what they and their government are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. I believe you hit a nerve.